They say a wild Mustang will never approach a human unless something deeper than instinct calls it forward. On a cold autumn morning in the Wyoming wilderness, a striking dun-colored Mustang with a dark stripe along its back appeared on the edge of a broken-down ranch. There was something in its eyes, something ancient, almost knowing. It didn't just look at Mason Riley, it called to him. Mason, a battle-hardened Army Ranger still grieving the loss of his grandfather, felt something shift inside when their eyes met. He didn't know why, but he followed that Mustang, leaving logic behind as he trailed it deep into the forest. What he found there would change everything. But before we continue, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and make sure you're subscribed. Tomorrow's story might just hit you even harder. The gravel crunched under Mason's boots as he stepped out onto the porch of his grandfather's weathered ranch house. A chill rode the Wyoming wind, thick with the scent of pine and the promise of snow. Winter always came early out here. 3 weeks had passed since the funeral. 3 weeks since Mason had stood alone at the gravesite, clutching the folded flag in shaking hands. He whispered, "I should have come back sooner," to a yard that could no longer answer. The wind whistled mournfully through gaps in the old barn walls, like it heard him. Mason had spent 12 years in the Army Rangers, endless deployments, endless distance. His grandfather's letters had followed him through deserts and war zones, always full of updates from Harmony Valley, never once mentioning Mason's silence in return. Then came the news of Samuel Riley's death. Something cracked inside. 2 weeks later, Mason signed his discharge papers and drove west, with no plan, just a need to face what he'd left behind. That morning, something moved along the edge of the pasture. Mason instinctively reached for a sidearm that wasn't there. Not a deer, not elk, a horse, wild, dun-colored, not from any nearby ranch. It stood at a broken section of the fence, mane whipping in the breeze, unafraid, its eyes locked with his, still, waiting. "Where'd you come from?" Mason asked quietly. The Mustang didn't run. Instead, it pawed the ground once, then again. Mason, raised around horses and trained by a grandfather who once broke quarter horses for ranch work, knew this was no normal behavior. Wild horses didn't act like this, especially not alone. "You hungry, boy?" The Mustang tossed its head almost like it wanted him to follow. For a brief second, Mason swore it nodded, but then, an engine in the distance. The spell broke. The horse turned and vanished into the forest shadows. A blue pickup pulled into the driveway. Sheriff Jim Blackwood stepped out, gruff, weathered, and loyal. He'd been at the funeral. One of the few who still spoke of Samuel like he hadn't already become part of the past. "Mornin', Mason. Just checking in." Mason nodded, still scanning the tree line. "Coffee's hot." The sheriff followed his gaze. "See something?" Mustang, wild, walked right up to the fence. Blackwood raised an eyebrow. That time of year, they're usually up in Thunder Basin. Odd. Then, as if remembering something distant, the sheriff added, "Your grandfather used to talk about a Mustang like that. Said it only showed up when something big was about to change. Thought it was the same one every time." Mason blinked. His grandfather had never mentioned that in his letters, whatever it was. Samuel had kept that to himself, and now the Mustang was back. They stepped inside together, boots heavy on the old wooden steps, as if the silence of the ranch house had been waiting for them. Inside, it looked just as forgotten as the outside. Mason had only cleared enough space to sleep and eat. The rest remained buried in his grandfather's life. Boxes stacked high, surfaces covered in dust, and photos on the wall of a younger Samuel in uniform, standing beside men whose names Mason never knew. Sheriff Blackwood took a seat in a creaking kitchen chair, mug of black coffee in hand. "Got any plans for this place?" Mason leaned against the counter, cradling his mug between rough hands. "Haven't really thought that far ahead." "Well, it's yours now, lock, stock, and all 160 acres, Blackwood said gently. That weight of ownership, of legacy, settled deep in Mason's gut. I don't know if I'm cut out for ranching." "No one's asking you to become a cowboy," the sheriff said with a calm smile. "But you might find something out here that you won't find anywhere else. Peace." Mason looked away, uncomfortable. He'd seen enough therapists to recognize the tone. "I'm fine." "Sure you are," Blackwood said dryly, taking another sip. "That's why you're sleeping on a busted old couch and tossing enough whiskey bottles to stock a saloon." That hit too close. Mason's jaw tightened. "Was there something you needed, Sheriff?" "As a matter of fact, yeah. The VA hospital in Cheyenne's been trying to reach you. Your grandfather had a few things stored with them. Might be worth a look." Mason nodded. He'd deal with it, eventually. "One more thing," Blackwood said, standing up and brushing invisible crumbs from his pants. "Veterans Day memorial's next week. Your grandfather never missed it. Figured you'd want to know." Mason gave a quiet nod, but said nothing. The idea of standing in a crowd, listening to speeches about sacrifice and honor, it made his skin crawl. He'd been to too many funerals, heard too many hollow tributes. After Blackwood left, Mason found himself drawn again to the broken fence where the Mustang had stood. Maybe it had just been a lost wild horse separated from its herd. But those eyes, there was something in them, something too knowing. 3 days passed with no sign of it. Mason stayed busy, patching the barn, clearing brush, repairing what he could before the snow came. Physical labor helped quiet the noise in his head, helped bury the memories of gunfire and commands that still echoed in his dreams. Then, on the 4th morning, it returned. Mason spotted the Mustang from the barn, standing exactly where it had before, still as a statue against the wall of pines. He set down the bridle he'd been inspecting and walked slowly toward the fence. The horse didn't move, didn't flinch. "Back again?" Mason asked, stopping a few yards away. "Not much here for you." The horse snorted, then took a step back. Another, still watching him. It moved toward the trees, paused, then looked back. "You want me to follow, is that it?" The Mustang tossed its head, turned fully into the woods, and walked a few more paces, then stopped again. Mason hesitated. Winter was coming. There was work to do. Following a wild horse into the forest? It was reckless, maybe even dangerous, but his feet were already moving. "This is insane," he muttered, ducking through the broken fence. The horse led him along a faint trail winding between tall lodgepole pines. Mason followed at a respectful distance, his boots silent on the pine needle-covered ground. They walked steadily uphill, northwest. His old ranger instincts told him they were deep in Medicine Bow National Forest. Nearly an hour passed before the trees began to thin, revealing a clearing nestled in the folds of the mountains. At its center stood an old cabin, or what was left of one. The log structure had nearly collapsed in on itself, its roof sagging, porch buckled, chimney cracked and crumbling. Time and weather had done their damage. The Mustang stopped at the edge of the clearing, eyes fixed on Mason as he stepped forward. "What is this place?" Mason whispered, more to himself than to the horse. No mailbox, no tracks, no recent sign of life, only silence, and something waiting. There was no sign of life, no mailbox, no path, no smoke. And yet, something about the cabin stirred Mason's memory. Had his grandfather ever mentioned a place like this, hidden deep in the forest? He couldn't recall anything specific, but an unshakable feeling grew inside him. This place mattered, even if he didn't yet know why. The cabin door hung crooked, its rusted hinges clinging to the frame like an afterthought. Mason approached with caution. 12 years in the Rangers had made him hyper-aware of danger and stillness. He gently pressed the door open. The hinges groaned against the silence. Behind him, the Mustang let out a soft nicker, as if giving him permission to step inside. "Hello?" Mason called out into the shadows. Silence, for a beat. Then, "Samuel? That you, old friend? You finally came back for me." Mason froze. That voice, raspy, faint but undeniably human, came from inside. The cabin wasn't empty. Behind him, the Mustang pawed the earth softly, its mission complete. It had brought him here for a reason. Taking a breath, Mason stepped into the shadows, completely unprepared for what or who he would find. Quick pause. If you're still with us, hit that subscribe button. This story means a lot to us, and your support helps us keep going. Now let's get back to it. As Mason's eyes adjusted to the dark, dust danced in narrow shafts of light cutting through the cabin walls. The air was thick with the scent of time, mildew, pine, and illness. "Samuel?" The voice came again, weaker this time. Mason moved carefully. Stepping over a broken chair and scattered debris, he found a cot in the far corner. A frail man lay beneath worn blankets, skin paper-thin, face pale and drawn, but his eyes, when they met Mason's, were startlingly sharp. "No, sir, my name is Mason Riley. Samuel was my grandfather." A painful cough rattled through the man's chest, followed by a weak smile. "Riley," he whispered, "I see it now. You've got his jawline." The old man extended a trembling hand. Mason gently took it, startled by its fragility. "Thomas Winters," he said with a flicker of strength. "Your grandfather saved my life in '68, Vietnam. I was the unit's medic. Patched him up after a mortar strike should have killed him." His eyes dimmed. "He's gone, isn't he?" Mason nodded, his voice tight. 3 weeks ago, heart failure." Thomas sank back into the pillow, eyes wet with grief. "I always thought he'd outlive me." The room was small, barely livable. A cold stove sat untouched, empty food cans, a few old prescriptions lined a shelf. The kerosene lamp on a crate gave the room a makeshift hospital feel, one that had clearly run out of supplies and time. "How long have you been out here, Mr. Winters? Do you have any family nearby?" Thomas shook his head. "Martha, my wife, she passed 5 years ago. Samuel used to check in, bring food, help me keep going. But when he stopped coming..." His voice trailed off. He didn't need to finish. Guilt hit Mason like a punch to the chest. Even as his own health declined, Samuel had been making the trip to this remote cabin alone. "When's the last time you had a real meal, or saw anyone?" Thomas gave a sad chuckle. "Hard to say. Days blur out here. That horse brought you, didn't it? The dun Mustang?" Mason froze. "You know about the horse?" A thin smile crept across Thomas's cracked lips. "That horse has been seen in these mountains for years. Your grandfather called it our guardian angel. Showed up when it was time to change something." Thomas coughed again, worse this time. Mason stepped forward. "Sir, you need medical care. I'm taking you to a hospital." "No hospitals," Thomas snapped, his voice firmer than before. "Seen enough of them to last 2 wars. You need food, shelter, help. What I need," Thomas said, steady now, "is to see what Samuel left for me." He nodded toward a cracked leather satchel hanging on a peg near the door. "Your grandfather said, if anything ever happened to him, you'd bring me what I needed." Mason retrieved the bag and brought it to the cot, placing it gently beside the old man's trembling hands. Thomas undid the clasp with effort and pulled out a sealed envelope. He stared at it for a long moment before handing it to Mason. "My eyes ain't what they used to be. You read it." Mason opened the letter, his grandfather's handwriting immediately recognizable. He cleared his throat and began, "Thomas, old friend, if you're reading this, then I've gone ahead of you on that final patrol. I've asked Mason to bring you home, to Whispering Pines, where you belong. The cabin was never meant to be forever. It was just a place for you to rest. Now it's time to come back." The letter ended with one final line. "From the mountain, I've made arrangements. Trust my grandson the way you once trusted me. He carries our legacy, even if he doesn't know it yet. Your brother in arms, Samuel." Mason lowered the paper, a tight lump forming in his throat. It hadn't been random. His grandfather had planned this, trusted that Mason would find Thomas when the time was right. Suddenly, the Mustang's appearance didn't feel like fate. It felt like a promise being kept. Thomas's eyes shimmered, his voice cracking with emotion. "He always had to have the last word, didn't he?" He exhaled sharply. "Looks like I don't have much of a choice now." "I've got a truck," Mason offered, already thinking through the forest routes. "But it's a long way from here to the ranch. I'll need help. There's an old trail. Thomas said, pointing weakly. About half a mile east, wide enough for an ATV. Emergency crews used it once. Mason nodded. I'll call the sheriff, get search and rescue. But first, let's get you more comfortable. He knelt by the cold wood stove, found kindling, and struck a match. Soon a small fire was crackling, warming the musty air. He located a dusty canteen and helped Thomas sip carefully. The old man's hands trembled violently, spilling more than he drank. How long were you and my grandfather friends? Mason asked, trying to keep Thomas alert, but also genuinely curious. Thomas leaned back, breathing easier now that the room was warmer. Met in basic training. 67. Two farm boys who'd never been more than 50 miles from home. He saved my life more times than I saved his, not that he'd ever admit it. He paused, then added quietly, he didn't talk much about Vietnam. None of us did. Some memories are better left buried. Mason glanced at his phone. No signal. He hadn't expected one this deep in the forest. I need to head back. Get help. Will you be okay for a few hours? Thomas nodded faintly. I've survived worse. Then his hand shot out, gripping Mason's wrist with surprising force. That horse, it's special. Your grandfather believed it showed up for a reason. I think he was right. Mason gently pulled free. Rest. I'll be back soon. Outside, the clearing was empty. The Mustang had vanished again, just as mysteriously as before. Mason scanned the tree line, but saw nothing. He turned toward the trail Thomas had mentioned, found the overgrown path, and began to jog. Questions churned in his mind, the horse, the cabin, his grandfather's secrets, but he pushed them aside. There wasn't time for answers, only urgency. The hike back felt faster, his pace driven by adrenaline. When the fence line of whispering pines finally came into view, his shirt was drenched with sweat despite the cold. He ducked through the broken section and sprinted to the house. Inside, he grabbed his phone and called Sheriff Blackwood. Sheriff, it's Mason Riley, he said, trying to steady his breath. I need help. There's a man, Thomas Winters. He served with my grandfather. He's alive but in bad shape. He's at a cabin deep in the forest. A pause. Then, Thomas Winters? Blackwood's voice was stunned. I haven't heard that name in years. Your grandfather used to talk about him, but most folks figured he'd died long ago. He's alive, Mason said firmly. But not for long if we don't move fast. He gave directions as best he could, referencing the hidden trail and landmarks. I know the place, Blackwood said finally. Old Winter family hunting cabin. Land was sold off to the Forest Service decades ago. Sit tight. I'll call search and rescue. They'll bring in an ATV and stretcher. I'm going back up. Mason, let the professionals handle it. He's been alone too long. Another pause. Then, all right, but bring food, water, extra blankets. I'll meet you at the base of the trail. Mason moved fast. Supplies went into a backpack. As he stepped back onto the porch, he stopped. The Mustang had returned. It stood at the forest edge, watching him, silent and still. There you are, Mason muttered, slinging the pack over his shoulder. He approached slowly, expecting the horse to bolt, but it didn't. Instead, it turned, stepped into the trees, and paused, waiting. Twice in one day, Mason whispered. All right then, lead the way. The second journey through the forest passed in silence. Clouds gathered overhead. The temperature dropped. Shadows stretched long. Still, the Mustang moved with purpose, steady, confident, always pausing at steep inclines or fallen trees as if making sure Mason could follow. It never hesitated. It never looked lost. And then, smoke. As the cabin clearing came into view, Mason's heart lurched. Something was wrong. There was no more smoke rising from the chimney. Mason ran. The Mustang stopped at the forest's edge, watching just as it had before. Thomas, Mason called, shoving open the door. The cabin was colder now. The fire had gone out. The air was still. Thomas lay on the cot, eyes closed, breath shallow and uneven. Mason dropped his pack and rushed to his side. Thomas, can you hear me? He pressed his fingers to the old man's wrist. A pulse, weak, but still there. Samuel, Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible. No, it's Mason, sir. Help is on the way. Cold, Thomas gasped. So cold. Mason quickly rebuilt the fire, feeding it dry kindling until a flame caught and warmth returned to the room. He pulled out the blankets and layered them gently over Thomas's frail body. Then, helping him sip water and take a few bites of sandwich, Mason tried to coax strength back into him, but it was clear the old man was fading. "There's a metal box," Thomas rasped suddenly, voice thin as paper. "Under the cot. Get it." Mason knelt and reached beneath the narrow bed, his fingers closing on a small, heavy object. He pulled it out, a battered military ammo box, its olive paint chipped with age. Inside were carefully preserved mementos, a velvet case with a tarnished medal, a pair of dog tags, faded photographs, and a neatly folded American flag. "My wife's flag," Thomas said softly, seeing the confusion in Mason's face. "Your grandfather brought it to me after her funeral, told me I should keep it, that she'd always be watching over me." Mason picked up one of the photographs. Two young men in uniform, standing arm in arm in front of a helicopter. One of them was unmistakably his grandfather. The resemblance was jarring. "That was taken 2 days before the ambush," Thomas said. "The day Samuel earned his Silver Star." Mason looked up, stunned. He never mentioned a medal. "He wouldn't," Thomas replied. "Said the medal belonged to the men who didn't come home." He reached for the box again, hands trembling. "These are yours now. Your inheritance." Mason started to speak, to refuse, but Thomas's eyes had closed again. His breathing grew weaker, and then engines, voices outside. Help had arrived. The next moments blurred into action. Search and rescue personnel flooded the cabin, moving swiftly but gently. Thomas was carefully lifted onto a specialized stretcher. Sheriff Blackwood oversaw everything, throwing Mason the occasional glance, especially at the metal box he now carried close. The Mustang was gone, disappearing silently into the forest once the vehicles arrived, like it had never been there at all. At the base of the trail, an ambulance waited. Paramedics worked quickly, oxygen mask, IVs, rapid assessment. "He needs Mercy Hospital," one of them told Mason. "His condition's critical." "I'll follow in my truck," Mason said, refusing to let the old man out of his sight. As the ambulance doors closed, Sheriff Blackwood stepped up beside him. "Hell of a coincidence, you finding Thomas after all these years." Mason thought of the letter, the Mustang, the inexplicable instinct that pulled him to follow. "No," he said quietly. "I don't think it was a coincidence." Blackwood studied him for a beat. "You think your grandfather had a hand in this?" Mason looked down at the box in his arms. "I think he planned it. I think that horse knew exactly what it was doing." The sheriff gave a slow nod, face softening. "Samuel always said some things in this world go beyond logic. Wasn't one for superstition, but he believed in that horse. Said it always showed up when someone needed finding." "You believe that?" Mason asked. "I believe your grandfather did. And Samuel Riley wasn't a man prone to fantasy." Mason didn't argue. He didn't need to. He climbed into his truck, set the metal box on the passenger seat, and followed the flashing ambulance lights down the mountain road, his mind spinning with questions, his heart still heavy with the weight of all he didn't yet understand. Back in the woods, beneath the thickening shadows of dusk, the dun-colored Mustang watched them leave. Its work, for now, was done. In the harsh fluorescent light of Mercy Hospital's waiting room, Mason sat alone. The contents of Thomas's box were spread before him on a table. 4 hours had passed. Doctors had rushed Thomas into surgery the moment they arrived. Mason recognized much of their language. None of it was good. He picked through the memories left behind, his grandfather in uniform, crouched beside soldiers covered in mud and blood, an entire unit posed outside a field hospital, young men with 1,000-yard stares he knew all too well. He picked up a pair of dog tags, not his grandfather's. Daniel J. Petersonen. The name caught in his memory. Mason. He looked up. Sheriff Blackwood stood before him, 2 cups of coffee in hand. He offered one. Mason took it gratefully. "Why would Thomas have Daniel Peterson's dog tags?" Mason asked, holding them up. Sheriff Blackwood sat down beside him with a tired grunt. "Because Daniel's alive. Runs the general store in Harmony Valley, just a few miles from your grandfather's ranch." Mason was stunned. "He's alive?" I thought everyone did, Blackwood nodded. Thomas saved his life in Vietnam. Your grandfather carried him 2 miles to the evac zone while Thomas kept him from bleeding out. Mason sat in silence, realizing his grandfather had been part of a brotherhood he never fully understood. Men bonded through war, carrying stories he'd never been told. A doctor approached. You family of Thomas Winters? I'm Mason Riley. My grandfather was his closest friend, he said, standing. Mr. Winters is stable, for now. Severe pneumonia, dehydration. His age and isolation didn't help. He asked for you, and something about a horse. Room 212. Mason went in. Thomas looked small under the hospital sheets, wrapped in wires and tubing, barely breathing. Mason sat beside him. I'm here, Thomas. You're gonna be all right. No response, just the steady beep of machines. Mason stayed until a nurse urged him to rest. As he left, the night had fallen over the Wyoming sky. In his truck, he received a text. Daniel Peterson wants to see you. Diner, 9 a.m. The next morning, Mason arrived at the town diner. Daniel, thin but sharp-eyed, looked up from his booth. My God, he whispered. You're the spitting image of Samuel. They talked over coffee and eggs. When Mason mentioned the Mustang, Daniel's eyes darkened. That horse saved me once, back in '72, stood between me and the edge of a cliff. Samuel found me the next morning. After that, we started calling it our guardian angel. Mason admitted, it led me to Thomas. Twice. It's still at the ranch. Daniel smiled. Still there? That's new. Soon after, Ellie Collins, the town vet, arrived. That Mustang's still at your place? Mind if I stop by later? I've worked with the Wild Horse Conservation Program. Mason nodded. Sure, any time. Sheriff Blackwood interrupted. Mason, Thomas is asking for you. It's urgent. At the hospital, Mason and Daniel found Thomas awake, barely. Thomas pointed to the metal box. Mason opened it, removed the dog tags, and handed them to Daniel. He kept them all these years. Daniel blinked through tears. I gave these to him the day I was evacuated. Told him to return them when we were both home. Thomas's eyes pleaded silently. Then Mason understood. My grandfather wanted all of you together, one last time. At Whispering Pines. Daniel squeezed Thomas's hand. We'll make it happen. Suddenly, machines blared, doctors rushed in. Thomas was going into respiratory distress. Mason and Daniel were ushered out. Thomas stabilized hours later, but the outlook remained grim. Mason returned to the ranch. That night, he opened his grandfather's war journal, an unfiltered account of pain, heroism, and regret. He read about the Silver Star Samuel had never mentioned, and the horrors of a village called Kosan. Mason closed the journal with trembling hands. Outside, Whisper waited by the corral. Did you know him? Mason asked the horse softly. Is that why you brought me to Thomas? Whisper simply turned and walked toward the trees. Days passed. Mason prepared the foreman's quarters at the ranch for Thomas's return. Ellie visited often, offering not just feed for Whisper, but research on veteran and horse therapy programs. Mason's idea to turn the ranch into a sanctuary began to take shape. Then, unexpectedly, Lewis Parker, the final member of Samuel's unit, arrived on his own. Elderly and confused, he still remembered the war and Samuel. They gathered again for dinner, Daniel, Lewis, and Mason waiting for Thomas. The Mustang watched from the fence, always silent, always present. Later, Thomas left the hospital against doctor's orders, walked miles into the forest, trying to reach Whispering Pines before it was too late. Whisper found him first. When Mason reached them, Thomas was barely alive. I had to make it, he whispered. We're running out of time. Thomas was saved, again, thanks to the Mustang. Back at the ranch, a note from Thomas awaited Mason. Some promises can't wait. Under the cabin bed, there's a box Samuel left for you. If you're reading this, the time is now. Mason found the box. Inside, a silver star, an American flag, and a final letter from his grandfather. This place is more than a ranch. It's redemption. a place where broken things can heal. I hope you'll consider staying and making it your own. Mason stayed. He brought Thomas home, reunited the four veterans, opened the gates of Whispering Pines to a new future. Ellie helped. Lewis stayed. Daniel supported the dream, and Whisper remained. Soon other Mustangs joined. Other veterans arrived. The ranch began to grow into something more, a sanctuary where horses and heroes could heal together. And Mason, once lost in his own past, now stood grounded in something new. A purpose, a legacy, a home. If this story moved you, subscribe now for more real-life inspired narratives about hope, healing, and the quiet power of connection. 2 more powerful stories are waiting right here on your screen. Just click to watch.